Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the sixth of the dialogue series organized by the Alliance for African Partnership. Today, we have a particularly interesting topic, COVID-19 impact in Africa, opportunities for partnership and engagement. And we have a very distinguished panel that includes Claudia Frittelli, Program Officer, Higher Education and Research in Africa, the Carnegie Corporation of New York; Innocent Chukwuma, Regional Director, West Africa, Ford Foundation; Tibor Nagy, Assistant Secretary, Bureau of African Affairs, U.S. Department of State; Himdat Iqbal Bayusuf, Task Team Leader, African Centers of Excellence, World Bank Group; Somachi Chris Asuluka, Head, Policy and Partnerships, Tone Elumelo Foundation; and Caro Karuga, CEO, Kenya Private Sector Association. This topic is, of course, extremely interesting for all of us, certainly in the higher education sector. It's also, of course, of interest to people in other sectors. Let me just briefly share with you some opening thoughts on why it is important for us in higher education to look at the kinds of partnerships that we are needed in order for us to be able to manage this crisis that we're facing now, namely COVID-19. The relationship between universities and society are, of course, symbiotic. Public service and engagement is one of the four core missions of universities. The other three, of course, being teaching and learning, research and scholarship, and innovation and entrepreneurship. Universities, of course, benefit society in producing human capital, new knowledges, and as innovative and entrepreneurial hubs. In turn, universities derive their raison d'etre, resources and relevance from society in terms of students, funding, research topics, and so on. This symbiotic relationship between the academy and society is even more critical for both during a crisis as momentous as COVID-19. The pressures on universities and societies, of course, we all know them, having lived through this period for several months now. COVID-19 has engendered unprecedented pressures on all aspects of university operations. At the heart of these pressures are declining enrollment and finances, which threaten the stability and sustainability of many universities. Universities derive their finances from five main sources: government subventions, tuition fees, institutional income generation activities, such as auxiliary services, donations, and loans. In many countries, and for most higher education institutions, all these are squeezed at the moment. COVID-19 has also had devastating consequences on society, as we all know, encompassing massive disruptions of healthcare systems and national economies, many of which are in recession, that have devastated lives and livelihoods, employment and social well-being, along the social inscriptions of class, gender, age, location, and others. Crisis mitigation and post-crisis reconstruction requires the assets that universities are uniquely qualified to bring to society. These include, of course, training and retraining for old and new jobs, biomedical research for treatments, and socioeconomic research on impacts and effective interventions, innovations and reimaginations of new modes of social organization and living, from healthcare systems to safety nets, employment and work, socialization of the values of resilience, flexibility, adaptability, community, informed and critical citizenship. Forging productive partnerships for universities is critical with the following partners that universities, of course, value: the private sector, the public sector, the philanthropic sector, international and intergovernmental agencies, and civil society. All of these, of course, you'll hear from in this conversation. The focus of these partnerships have to be on three areas: what I call the hardware, strengthening institutional electronic infrastructures and platforms and access, enhancing institutional capacities or capabilities, facilitating spatial reorganization of teaching and learning spaces, and residential and recreational spaces on campus, which will become imperative as we move back to face-to-face teaching, hopefully in the near future. Secondly, is the software, promoting curriculum design and development for digitalized and lifelong learning, strengthening provision and access to virtual labs and simulations, and of course, enhancing access to Wi-Fi. Finally, there is the liveware, building new student pipelines and recruitment processes, faculty and student training for digitalized teaching and learning, facilitating faculty and student mobilities and curricular collaborations. Each of these partners for universities have specific roles and specific interventions and initiatives that they can undertake to help universities. For the private companies, they can partner with universities to develop short courses for employee training and retraining, provide opportunities for training of operators in the small medium enterprise sector and informal sector that are part of the value and supply chain of the company concerned, support university research in areas of mutual interest and benefit, partner with universities in curriculum development and student experiential learning. The public sector, of course, can work with universities in the provision of stimulus packages for the higher education sector, open to both private and public universities, review student aid programs and strengthen need-based aid, review and develop regulatory policies that support innovation in universities, review and develop policies that facilitate philanthropy for universities. This is particularly important for Africa. International and intergovernmental agencies also have their roles, mobilizing international support and providing institutional support for African universities, leveraging influence over African governments for policy reforms in higher education, promoting interinstitutional collaborations among African universities and between them and universities in other world regions, promoting multidisciplinary, multi-institutional, and multi-sectoral research. Civil society, of course, has its own ways of partnering with universities, cultivating strong alumni support for their alma maters, promoting joint research on important issues for civil society and NGOs and community-based organizations, undertaking joint activities in civic awareness raising and engagement, curbing anti-intellectualism and cultivating informed citizenship. Last but not least is, of course, the philanthropic sector, the philanthropic foundations. There are several trends that are now developing, and we'll hear more. According to the Philanthropy Roundtable, funders are communicating with current and prospective grantees to understand their needs, collaborating with other funders, providing more general operational support, awarding multi-year grants, fast-tracking grant approval processes, seeking to leverage public support, and trying to increase payout for 2020 and 2021. According to the African Philanthropy Forum, most of the donations have understandably gone to basic needs, including donations of foods and other relief supplies, hygiene products such as hand sanitizers, and personal protective equipment such as face masks. The pandemic presents an opportunity to address Africa's endemic, systemic, and structural challenges, including healthcare infrastructures, institutional weaknesses in administrative capacities, including data and research and training. The needs for higher education specifically that we have already seen and will see going forward is that universities need flexible emergency funding for electronic infrastructure and devices, curriculum redesign, student financial aid, mental health services, biomedical research for treatments, and socioeconomic research for effective policy interventions, and general operating support. According to a recent survey reported in the Chronicle of Higher Education that polled 380 college fundraisers and 53 institutions, 85% of fundraisers are responding to COVID-19 by focusing more on raising money to support financial aid and for disadvantaged students. And 74% are focusing on winning general operating support. More than 40% of respondents said their efforts no longer highlight capital projects. Support for virtual mobility of faculty and students and multi-institutional online teaching and learning, research and scholarship, and benchmarking are also critical for investors. And facilitating productive, mutually beneficial, broad-based, and productive diaspora engagements, which I know my colleague from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Claudia Frittelli, will appreciate, are also important during this moment. Finally, we have to think about the challenges, that the new philanthropic landscape in terms of higher education, the shift from alumni donors and capital projects to tech companies and virtual universities, leaving the campus experience the privilege of the very rich. We have to control for that, and we have to ensure that's not the case moving forward. I look forward, and I trust all of you look forward to hearing and learning more about these issues from our panelists. The first presenter will be my colleague from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Claudia Frittelli. Claudia, you have 10 minutes. I think you're muted.
Okay, thank you, Paul, thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me to AAP. I've benefited from the other dialogues, and it's very exciting to see this virtual form of dialogue. We support policy dialogues in higher education, and I think this is a superb example of what can be done virtually. So to give an overview of Carnegie Corporation, for those that don't know, Carnegie Corporation was founded in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie, who was a steel industrialist. Its mission is to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding for a more peaceful world. Andrew Carnegie believed that democracy, education, knowledge, and philanthropy are fundamental tools for strengthening the bonds of our society and bringing about a peaceful world. The foundation has had a long-standing interest in sub-Saharan Africa, really since the 1920s. And it's currently focused on developing the next generation of academics. We've also been supporting higher education since about 2000, higher education in Africa. So our current program, as I said, looks at the next generation of academics. And we do this through several prongs. One is through early career programs, so developing academics through doctoral and postdoctoral research and training opportunities at select universities and through university research networks like RU Forum, ARUA, CARTA, et cetera. And really the emphasis is on advancement and retention of academics in African universities. Another prong is the Academic Diaspora Linkages Program, and this connects African universities with academic diaspora communities, as Paul mentioned, to strengthen training and research at African universities and create mutually beneficial relationships. Thirdly, higher education policy and research. And the aim of this is really to create policy environments for higher education that are conducive to the development and retention of African academics. Our investment has, over the last five years, has been about 56 million. So we're a relatively small funder, and we're focused on particular institutions and have had long-standing relationships with those institutions. Our organization's funding priorities have not shifted under COVID-19. Actually, this slide, you can hold off on this slide. This is for later. The reason we see this as the current frame supporting postgraduate and postdoctoral fellows at diaspora linkages and policy are all areas that can fit within COVID. So we didn't really feel the need to change our strategies. But within each portfolio, the grantees are given the flexibility to adjust to the current environment. So that's pretty much how we've been seeing our grant making in this area during this time. So what we have seen is a lot of our capacity building workshops and many of our advisory committee meetings have gone virtual. Within our policy portfolio, we're in the midst of funding research on the private sector, on science granting councils, and a mapping of higher education policy. So what's changed is that now these surveys and interviews have gone virtual. So, you know, what effect does that have? And certainly the questions are going to be a lot more about the current environment. For example, how is the private sector coping in the COVID environment, which we hadn't anticipated when we supported this work. So within each portfolio, as I said, there have been adjustments to the current COVID environment. As far as regions and types of institutions, that has not changed either. The foundation, by its charter, limits funding in Anglophone Africa. Our key partner universities are in Ghana, South Africa, and Uganda. And then we reach other universities through networks like Arua and the ones I mentioned, RU Forum, et cetera. So I would say, you know, the organizations that are best placed to sort of fit this new environment, organizations like Arua and Future Africa, University of Pretoria, who are doing transdisciplinary work. They're working across regions and across disciplines. We see that also with a lot of our university funding that happening. And I think those are the organizations that are best placed to confront the new future with challenges like pandemics and other challenges that cross borders. So as far as our future, I think some of the areas where we currently support and will continue to support are research and graduate training. As far as online learning, we have limited funding in the area of online learning and professional development. We support an organization called Emerge Africa, which provides online professional development for instructional learners and staff and faculty that are converting to the remote learning environment. So we've been funding this actually for years, and they've kind of come into their own during this time. But we don't have a huge focus on technology currently. Within our diaspora linkages program, I think what's interesting is that we haven't so far, we fund a lot of fellowships that obviously involve travel, and so far we've postponed those until, you know, we hope that they can be placed later. But I think this is an area, and Paul is our chair of our advisory council for the Carnegie Africa Diaspora Program. So I think there will be conversations about how does the diaspora linkages work in a virtual and remote learning environment. So I think that's interesting for the future. I will say, let's see, we as, I should just add, as a corporation, we have funded a New York City COVID-19 Response and Impact Fund. So that's for New York City nonprofits. It's currently at about 110 million with contributions from 1,300 donors. And they've made grants to about 750 New York nonprofits. So that's something separate from the Higher Education and Research in Africa program, but I just wanted to mention that. And then if you just want to, the final slide, we sometimes look at African philanthropy. There's not a lot of funders in the US like us that fund building institutions and academics. So we kind of break it up. I mean, this is a slide that can be, you know, as a point of discussion really, but a lot of funders are focused on themes. So for example, Mellon Foundation has been focused on arts and humanity. Gates is very much on health and agriculture. And then there are others who are funded on, you know, interested in access and workforce development, like MasterCard Foundation, Kresge Foundation as well. So this is just kind of a way that we've sort of, you know, looked at the mapping of higher education funders. But I'd have to say that there's not a lot like us anymore that are focused just on building African universities and the higher education sector in Africa. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claudia, for sharing with us not only the history briefly of the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the areas of focus, but also giving us a broad overview of the funding landscape in the US with regards to Africa. The next speaker will be Innocent Chukwuma, Regional Director, West Africa Ford Foundation. Innocent?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I thank the Alliance for African Partnership for putting together this webinar, which gives us opportunity to sharing with the participants what we're doing in relation to higher education with the issues in Africa. By way of origin of Ford, as many people here probably know more than me, Ford started in 1936 in Detroit, Michigan, founded by Henry Ford and his son, Excel Ford, who are the founders of Ford Motors. But in Africa, Ford has also been around for quite a while. Ford started operations in Nigeria in 1958, and we have an office here that covers West African region with focal countries of Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal. We also have an office in Nairobi, looking at Eastern Africa, an office in Joburg, looking at Southern Africa, and another office in Cairo, looking at North Africa and Middle East. And interestingly, when Ford started funding in the region, in Africa, it actually focused essentially on higher education and also providing post-independent leaders with technical support to go for training to prepare them to take over the positions that were being vacated by the colonialists. A lot of people today who hear about Department of Public Administration in African University may not know that it's actually started by Ford Foundation, all in an effort to build the technical capacity of public servants and civil servants that were taking over vacating colonial jobs. The same thing in higher education, again in University of Nigeria and Nsukka. Last year I attended their 50th anniversary, the vocational education faculty, which was seeded by Ford Foundation, again to promote and support the training of technical skills that the country needed to be able to grow. And you can add in that list the Institute, International Institute of Tropical Agriculture in Ibadan, in Nigeria here, which was again supported by Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation. But we have since moved further down from that era of funding what we call brick and mortar institutions and projects because of the needs on the continent. Today, we look more on governance issues, and we have moved away from higher education. We now work essentially and mostly with civil society organizations, supporting them to hold government accountable, subsidize government where services are not being adequately provided. And our program areas today, in West Africa office in particular, we focus on two areas. One is ending violence against women and girls, which also has a resonance in campuses because of high level of sexual harassment that we notice in higher institutions. And the second level is natural resources and climate change, where we work with government and civil society partners to ensure that the vast abundance of natural resources that you have in Africa, that the proceeds actually are used to attend to the needs of majority of the people who are poor and vulnerable. So our relationship with universities in the prosecution of these two programs is on the basis of where we can get help, research support, technical support in terms of academics with vast experience in this area. But unlike Claudia, unfortunately, we no longer have a higher education program, which is regrettable for many of us that actually benefited from Ford Foundation scholarships and fellowships in the 60s, 70s, even down to the 2000s. One of the programs I had to organize the closing ceremony in 2013 when I joined was actually our international fellowship program. So to the question of what is our funding priorities today in relation to COVID-19, it has not radically shifted. We are still maintaining fidelity and support to our existing partners and providing them the leeway to take advantage of the resources to respond as a deemed fit to this pandemic. I was reading a joke somebody shared the other day that COVID-19 and its impact in the continent is like when you are crossing a road, you look left, you look right, and as you are crossing the road, a flight came from air and hit you. So many of our partners were actually not prepared for this. So we have converted project grants to general support. We have also allowed them to delay the takeoff where they couldn't implement because of the lockdown and all of that. And we have even doubled down. Many of you here might know that last month, Ford Foundation actually issued what we call social justice bond to raise $1 billion to essentially support social justice infrastructure in the arts and the program areas that our grantees are involved in, because many of these organizations are reeling because of the adverse impact of COVID-19. This funding will be spent over the next 18 months, and we are using them for multi-year grants that will last between 3 and 5 years to make sure that they have sufficient funding to enable them weather this. Because if we allow them to go under when COVID-19 ends, we may not find the institutions to continue the work that we are doing. And as I said earlier, in terms of the type of institutions we are funding, it's essentially civil society organization. We also support tangentially government partners where there's a need to link the two. We have not, we are not thinking of moving back to higher education unless our New York office changes the situation. And in terms of what we are leaning on, what we may fund in terms of research, societal learning and coping post-COVID-19 will be it for us, because when we move away from this emergency response where we are supporting our partners to improve testing capacity, improve personal protective equipment, there's also the livelihood and the impact on the economy. As we are seeing, Africa GDP is bound to reduce between 3 to 8% this year because of COVID-19. So how do we get our partners and the societies in which we work with to actually weather this pandemic and thrive in the post-pandemic area is a priority for us. And we are engaging with other partners to make sure that we have adequate funding to provide for this. But on the long run, I won't leave this webinar without sharing some realities, which is that after all this emergency funding and the effort of private foundations to actually increase their support, funding for universities and other civil society organizations in Africa is going to dwindle. We saw the other day, UK has merged its the DFID program with Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which means diplomacy, read politics is going to be the major consideration in terms of what is funded going forward. And we know that DFID funding through its various programs trickle down to a number of organizations and universities. So with all these bilaterals and multilaterals moving away and private foundation moving to fund fewer groups and providing more money, quite a lot of groups are going to be left off the hook. And this is where the whole idea of cultivating local philanthropy, the whole idea of finding ways of sustainable funding, both for universities and civil society organizations that we work with, have come to the fore. The days of excessive dependency on external funding may be numbered. I shouldn't be saying this, but beyond the immediate response that we are providing, there's going to be reckoning down the line. And that's where the webinar of this nature comes in, so that we can begin right at the onset of time to begin to ask ourselves hard questions. Where are we going to get funding to support critical institutions that underline the work that we do in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you for that illuminating presentation. I'm sure everyone will agree that the Ford Foundation has been, of course, a very important player in African philanthropic landscape. And he shared with us a little bit about the history, the changing focus of Ford support, as well as emergency funding that is taking place now. And I think his last appeal for the need to develop local philanthropy is well made. Our third speaker is Tibor Nagy, Assistant Secretary, Bureau of African Affairs, the U.S. Department of State.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody across the United States and Africa. For us, promoting U.S. African higher education partnerships has been one of my major goals. It predates COVID because I've been pushing for that since I came in the door back to this job in 2018. Because partnerships, from our point of view, is one of the best ways to respond to Africa's youth tsunami in ways that will make sure that it's a positive force for prosperity and economic growth, and not one of instability and conflict in the future. Also, when the COVID crisis ends, higher education institutions, I believe, will be more important than ever as instruments of recovery, learning, and national development. Partnerships, we know, make for stronger institutions. And America's highly diverse tertiary education system, from community colleges to small private liberal arts institutions to large state university systems, offer a wide variety of partnership opportunities and great models. Having worked 15 years in academia, I'm also convinced that fundamental characteristics of U.S. academia are appropriate for Africa's needs. Student-centered institutions, strong partnership with the private sector, curriculum which leads to jobs, outreach to the communities and outreach to agricultural extension, and online degree programs and library resources. The last point is especially relevant during COVID, as higher education must transition through the COVID phase, and we need to determine what happens on the other side. When I was in Africa as a US diplomat, I often thought of how much US universities could offer African partners. Then when I worked at a US university, I thought almost every day about how much African universities could offer American institutions. Now, more than ever, I believe the two sides can gain so much from each other, with the added factor of leveraging the resources and acumen of the US and African private sectors. This is not philanthropy. US and Africa share values of academic freedom, unfettered research, and intellectual integrity. If America doesn't work with our African partners, we know that others with a different agenda will fill the void. We at the State Department launched our University Partnership Initiative in February, just before COVID, with a forum on the margins of the annual Association of International Education Administrators Conference. Our goal is to establish or reinforce long-term relationships between US and African institutions, which include student and faculty exchanges, research collaboration, dual degree programs, ideas on university administration, and partnering with the private sector. During the past 2 months, State Department has supported 7 new partnership projects between US and African institutions involving over 100 US and African universities. And the initial funding for this was $2.6 million, which came from the State Department. These projects involve model partnerships in East, West, Central, Southern Africa, and cover subjects such as health, agricultural research, and building infrastructure for online learning. All projects designed to be flexible and will incorporate virtual elements as needed to allow for pandemic-related travel restrictions. 3 common elements these initiatives share. 1, build on relationships started through people-to-people exchanges, often sponsored by the US government. These personal connections are often essential to create lasting institutional links. 2, make creative use of technology and encourage study in the sciences, technology, and engineering. They promote online education techniques and platforms that will help in the near term with distance education during the pandemic, and in the long term to cement international cooperation. And then 3rd, in addition to State Department funds, almost all of these projects have significant investment, whether financial or in-kind, from the partner schools and host government themselves. Is that enough money? Absolutely not. From my point of view, that is just a start. I'm going to do my best, whatever time I have remaining in this position, to leverage the private sector and bring in as much additional funding as possible, because I truly believe that the best instruments for Africa's development really are its universities. Thank you very much. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Tibor, for sharing with us the perspective from the US State Department, but you also shared with us your own personal commitments to African tertiary development and the programs that have been launched recently in terms of bringing engagements and collaboration between American and African universities. And I think the last point is also well taken. They need to leverage the private sector for support for higher education initiatives, both in the US as well as, of course, in Africa, and in the relationship between those two. Our next speaker is Himdat Bayusuf.
Thank you very much. I just share my screen. Hopefully that is now available. 1 second. Yes, so I wanted to briefly today talk about the higher education engagement within the World Bank Group with respect to Sub-Saharan Africa. And in particular, I would like to take the opportunity, since we have quite a large audience, to also talk about potential areas of partnerships that we could engage in. So I won't spend too much time on the context and the status of the sector. I think we all know that higher education is indeed growing within the region at an average of about 9%. We do have, it's still one of the lowest globally, but the potential is very high. And this is something that I think is one of the, I think COVID-19 is going to be a key part in sort of transitioning institutions towards the virtual learning aspect. Within the World Bank Group, our current portfolio is approximately, within the Africa region, is approximately $5 billion, of which approximately 20% is within higher education, which is quite a high number, given that overall the sub-region has about 50% of the overall global investments within higher education. The portfolio is quite diverse in the sense that a large space of this investment is within what we call regional higher education programs, where we have cross-country projects that support the regional specialization, given the scarce resources and economies of scales within higher education delivery. And that's a big portion of the program, in addition to country national programs where we have quite a high investment and support to governments and to support projects in, for example, Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire, where we have almost $100 million, and in Burkina recently a $60 million project supporting country institutions. And then, of course, we do have some support around the analytical work around, you know, the sort of student financing aspect, around accreditation, around sort of the transition towards from basic education towards higher education, and the various equity and labor linkages challenges there. On the specific issues around COVID, I think one of the big important lessons coming out is that there is a huge need and a challenge around teaching and learning and switching towards remote learning. But the current situation within the continent is quite stark in the sense that the accessibility to fixed broadband and of course, in terms of mobile penetration, it's very good with internet connectivity. In fact, one of the highest rates globally, but in terms of access to fixed broadband, I think that is something that really, if we are to make the transition, I think is something that has really come up as an important challenge to address if we are to do teaching and learning through the virtual mechanism. Another challenge is around research, where we have, I think, important points that was raised by the previous speakers in terms of slowing down potential research opportunities, and around, you know, the issues around examination, graduations and admissions, given the impact of COVID-19 on closing institutions, as well as the effect also on private universities and how the pandemic is affecting the potential of the sustainability of some of the private institutions. But having said that, I think one of the key aspects is the opportunities that arise within, or at least the push factors that African universities have with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is really, as I said, an important moment to switching to remote learning and addressing sort of that massification of higher education so that more can access, but at the same time, of course, at a quality level. And as well, the transition towards digital skills and the digital economy, I think, has been a key driver of many countries. But I think with COVID-19, this is something that even within the delivery of sort of the basic education sectors and supporting teachers, you do need digital literacy within that. So that's just something that the universities have to play a very important role in. So the World Bank approach towards the response is based upon sort of 3 key areas around relief, so providing a needs assessment and looking at how we can promote, zero-rated access for education delivery with access to low-cost websites, remote learning, around recovery, and around resilience. We have, in the last 4 months, a lot of work has gone around the basic secondary education respect to our existing operational portfolio. So looking at how we can support countries have their ensure continued learning for students during the 4-month shutdown within our country's support. So for example, in how to ensure that students can also be ready to come back to school and we don't lose them during these 3-4 months that they're out of school. And so supporting the recovery and as well as the resilience around continued distance learning. So, but having said that, higher education is still a big part of of the World Bank response as well. But the key part, I think, is in sort of the immediate need has been sort of on the basic and secondary side, but the existing instruments within the higher education projects is also to allow for a response. On the sort of specifics within the higher education sector, I think I'll just elaborate on a couple of big regional initiatives. The first one is the Africa Centers of Excellence program. So this project is about almost $500 million over the last, within this 4 or 5 years. The first one was in 2014, and it looks at competitively funded institutions across the continent to expand postgraduate training, education, research within key areas from health, agriculture, oil and gas, mining, statistics, maternal health, infectious diseases, etc. So key areas that there's a skills gap, but there's also an applied research need. And the program has scaled up since 2014 to 2020. We are supporting almost 70 Africa Centers of Excellence, and the ACEs, as they are known, are hosted within universities. They comprise of 1 or 2 faculty, sometimes multidisciplinary, and the focus is on performance-based financing, where each institution gets approximately $4 to $8 million per ACE to support education delivery. And this, I think, is very much an exciting program because a big part of it is a bottom-up approach where the centers themselves submitted proposals on the areas that they want to focus. And I think this is one of the key changes where the funding actually comes to African institutions to identify and propose key issues that are addressing the countries. So just to jump to the COVID response, what's been really interesting with the ACE programs, for example, and here within ACE, we're talking about supporting almost 20 countries, 70 ACEs across all these different sectors. And we're very, very, very proud to say that the Africa Centers of Excellence for Genomics, Infectious Diseases in Nigeria was actually the first institution to sequence the COVID-19 virus back in March 2020. And that was a huge signal on the scientific capacity within the continent to be able to address immediately to the research and applied needs around responding on the COVID sort of drug development and even vaccine development. So ACEGID, which is based in Redeemers University, was a key player. It was also a key player during the Ebola crisis, as well as other institutions at the University of Ghana with the Nguchi Memorial Institute, as well as in addition to the applied research, there's also been a lot of testing that they've been working with the Ministry of Health. So
you have 1 minute. 1 minute.
Yes, thank you so much. So the second aspect has been on the technology, innovation, and development. So the printing of PPE materials, supporting the printing of the face shields, etc., that the engineering departments have been very key in, as well as supporting the community outreach and the health aspects. And I think this is key to show that the African universities are leading within countries and are a huge resource for countries to be able to respond adequately. And one of the things that I would like to sort of part with is these are the ACEs that we have currently. They're all over the sub-region. We have in almost every country. In Nigeria, we have 17. In Ghana, we have 9. They're in all material science, power, energy, agriculture. And within this, a big part of it is the switch towards virtual teaching and learning, which the ACE funding allows or supports the institutions to do. We're sort of retrofitting and reprogramming, but there is that flexibility there. One of the things I must say is our partner, the Association of African Universities, has been absolutely fundamental to coordinate and facilitate. And just today we had a webinar with almost 300 people on the use of technology in virtual teaching and learning. And this is something that the program and the project is providing. And there are lots of partnership opportunities. If you go to the two various ACE websites, and all the information on who to contact in terms of the center leaders is available if you want to work with them within water, agriculture, waste management, etc. And within this COVID pandemic, I think the sort of financing flexibility that is already there, I think is something that will be key. And as well, of course, our national higher education projects as well, they are supporting virtual universities. So I will just stop there. I know time is up, but I would like to emphasize that this is a huge opportunity for various partners. The key aspect here is it's a bottom-up approach. The areas of focus is based on what the university and the country priorities are. And I will just leave with one point that this is a financing based upon results. So obviously some of the areas that you would like to work with around applied research, around international quality and meeting global benchmarks, around sustainability, etc., are all part of the design. So thank you so much, and I will stop there. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Himdat, for sharing with us what the World Bank has been doing in terms of areas of focus and the enormous amounts of resources that are being put into working with African universities. Of course, this started long before COVID, and of course it's intensifying with COVID. And of course, you underscored some of the challenges as well as opportunities and responses in terms of dealing with relief from current challenges, recovery, and of course, resilience. And I think your last point was extremely important, that through the African Centers of Excellence, you are able to get these universities to contribute significantly to all sorts of mitigations against COVID specifically, but also against other areas that are of interest to African higher education institutions in terms of contributing to social, economic, and political development. Our next speaker is Somachi Chris Asoluka.
Thank you so much, AAP. We're very happy and honored as the Tony Elumelu Foundation to be a part of this very important dialogue series. I think Justin will put up my slides in a second. Thank you very much, Justin. So it's only a 10-minute presentation, so I'm going to be very quickly, run through what we do at the Tony Elumelu Foundation. So the Tony Elumelu Foundation is Africa's leading philanthropy focused exclusively on empowering young African entrepreneurs. We were founded in 2010 by Mr. Tony Elumelu, one of the continent's most successful entrepreneurs, but more importantly, a firm believer in the potential of African youth to transform our continent for good. So in 2010, when we started the Tony Elumelu Foundation, since then, we've engaged in a series of programs, to identify and support young Africans. But in 2015, we launched our flagship program called the Tony Elumelu Foundation Entrepreneurship Program. And what this program is essentially, it's $100 million commitment over 10 years to identifying, mentoring, training, and funding at least 1,000 African entrepreneurs every year for 10 years. It's only about 6 years now. We've empowered over 10,000 entrepreneurs. We've surpassed that goal. We've been able to do that working with partners across the United Nations Development Bank, the African Development Bank, GIZ, the German Development Agency, the International Community of the Red Cross, amongst other partners. And the reason why the partners have approached us to scale is because they have identified our focus on entrepreneurs as a viable, sustainable means to transform the continent from the grassroots up. We identify entrepreneurs across all 54 African countries. So we have alumni based across the entire continent. We empower these entrepreneurs through direct funding, mentoring, training, capacity building. And I think even just as important as the funding we give them is the advocacy and the policy change that we're able to rally on their behalf. You know, in each country, our founder visits the presidents, the heads of states, relevant public sector officials to engage them based on the needs of entrepreneurs in those countries, in those cities, in those communities. You know, we're able to engage and let these policymakers know the challenges of the entrepreneurs, the constraints that they face, and the type of enabling environment that entrepreneurs across the continent need in order to flourish and build businesses that thrive. It's only these entrepreneurs and their businesses that can employ the millions of youth in the African labor force that are currently unemployed or underemployed. And so we see entrepreneurship as that most sustainable model to transform the continent for good. Our network includes over 10,000 entrepreneurs that we have directly funded. We also have a digital proprietary hub, TF Connect, where we connect nearly 1 million young African entrepreneurs to additional funding. Sorry, I think the host had some issues. So on our TF Connect platform, we have over 1 million young entrepreneurs that we connect to additional funding, additional training, investors, mentors, and additional opportunities to develop their capacity. Can I go to the next slide, please? A number of questions we get around, you know, the work we do is certainly acknowledging the innovative role entrepreneurs, you know, will play in the communities. And we have partners who are willing to work with us to scale our programs. But some of the impacts we've been able to see in only 6 years, you know, we've helped entrepreneurs transform their business for good. On the screen now, you see how many jobs our entrepreneurs are able to create in a number of years. You see the increase, the enormous increase in business revenue growth. A lot of these startups, when they came to us, were only ideas or, you know, in that research stage, but now are in the growth stage of their entrepreneurship journey. We've also have entrepreneurs who are 100% committed to the Sustainable Development Goals as one of our criteria. So all entrepreneurs in our program are able to demonstrate that not only are they fulfilling a business need in their communities, but they're also giving back to the African continent by helping Africa achieve the SDGs by 2030. Again, when we started out, we realized that women entrepreneurs were not as confident as confident in their potential and their capacity as their male entrepreneurs. So we saw a lot of young men applying to our program in like a 70-30% ratio. So since then, we've had targeted campaigns at women. We've helped women, you know, go through the applications. We've identified female role models to encourage other young women in their different communities to apply. We have certain business training skill sessions for women. And we've been able to see that percentage increase to 42% in only under 3 to 4 years. So we're very committed to gender equality. We're very committed to working with young women entrepreneurs as well as their male counterparts. But we do realize that lots of African young women need that extra support, need that extra push, and need that extra attention and focus in believing in themselves to become entrepreneurs. You know, over our 6 years journey, we've been able to identify several other insights, you know, along this line that helps us reform our strategy and help us advise policymakers and partners who want to do good work in Africa. I will wrap up very quickly, but I just wanted to take the audience through ways that we empower entrepreneurs. So we empower them through training. The training is has been likened to a mini MBA for the African continent. We teach our entrepreneurs what it is and what it takes to, to build and sustain a business that thrives, given the unique African context. So this business management training takes them through the rigorous processes of registering a business, building a team on the continent, filing your taxes on the continent, doing some marketing and R&D, etc. on the continent. We also match each entrepreneur to a mentor who has worn similar shoes. Entrepreneurship is a very lonely journey, and so we're able to work with these entrepreneurs using mentors who are able to give them direct counseling, guidance, and that shoulder to rely on and those expert eyes to help support our entrepreneurs as needed. We also connect them through alumni hub meetups. Again, I think I touched on this earlier, where we rally our entrepreneurs physically as well when we go to visit them on field visits, and also convene them with their policymakers. So the policymakers are able to hear directly from these entrepreneurs on what works, what challenges exist, the constraints that they need in order to build a more enabling environment. Based on these meetups, we've had successful policy changes across the continent, working with the ministries of entrepreneurship, ministries of youth, ministry of small businesses to change the enabling environment for entrepreneurs across the entire continent. We also have several training sessions, investor matching on TF Connect. TF Connect, again, is our digital proprietary platform. We have nearly 1 million entrepreneurs who are learning from each other, forging unique partnerships with each other, and are able to finally, we give each entrepreneur on our program a seed capital of $5,000 each. We acknowledge that $5,000 isn't all it takes to build a thriving business on the continent, but a lot of entrepreneurs have demonstrated that $5,000 is the difference between surviving and dying, is the difference between converting your ideas to a business, is the difference in hiring an extra hand to help you build your startup dream, is the difference in getting a laptop, printer, and other basic office tools that you need to realize your idea. So the $5,000 is not all the entrepreneurs will need, but we believe it's a good platform to get them to a stage where they're able to pitch to additional investors and get the investment that they need to grow their businesses. The next slide, please. I think we can go to the next slide. I've touched on this. Again, I just want to, quickly demonstrate the number of entrepreneurs on the continent. When we started out, we got a lot of people asking, is Africa really ready to take that entrepreneurship leap? Do you have enough entrepreneurs on the continent? Are African entrepreneurs, viable? Do they have viable ideas, viable businesses? And I just want to show you the applications that we received in 1 year alone. In 2019, we got over 200,000 applications from 54 African countries. This shows you the enormous potential on the continent. Of course, giving our $100 million commitment, we're able to empower a limited number each year. But then if we could, we would love to empower all 200,000 of these. These cut across all African countries, cut across all sectors imaginable, from ICT to agriculture to education to retail to fashion. African entrepreneurs have amazing ideas, amazing startups across all these sectors. Of course, we're also reaching rural entrepreneurs as well as urban entrepreneurs. Our program is not elitist. We don't believe that you need an academic educational degree to be an entrepreneur. So we're reaching those without any schooling certificates. We're reaching those who are in rural communities and villages. We're reaching those in the cities. We're reaching everyone across the continent, because we believe that all African entrepreneurs, no matter where they are, should have a chance at being able to demonstrate their business ideas and turn their ideas into successful businesses. I think the final slide is the last slide. Could we quickly go to the next slide? Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so very quickly, again, very mindful of the time, but what some of the things on the screen you'll see are some of the benefits of our alumni. Again, we have over 10,000 alumni across the continent that have directly benefited and been funded by the Tony Elumelu Foundation. But then we know again that $5,000 isn't all they need. And so we're able to
you
connect
have 1 minute.
Yes. I told you this was my last slide. Yes,
Okay,
very aware. Thanks so much, Paul. Very aware. So some of the things that our alumni are able to benefit, access to additional funding. We work with partners across the world to give these entrepreneurs additional investments beyond the $5,000 that we give them. We also give them business exposure and access to networking events. Again, we work with our partners all across to introduce these entrepreneurs to supply chains, to value chains, to corporate organizations where they can serve. Our vision for these entrepreneurs is to transform them from being startups and being SMEs to becoming large corporates one day in the future. Again, we can't overemphasize the importance of training, and so we're always training and deepening the capacity of our entrepreneurs, using all our training tools and our partner tools on TF Connect. Again, we also offer mentorship, lifelong mentorship opportunities to all our alumni. Entrepreneurship is a lonely journey, and TEF is very, committed to making sure that entrepreneurs have all the tools, the networks, the resources, and the capacity skills to scale their ideas and their startups into large corporates one day. We're very excited again to be part of this conversation. We thank the AAP and all partner organizations. The Tony Elumelu Foundation is very happy to work with, like-minded institutions and individuals across the continent and beyond in identifying and supporting these African entrepreneurs to thrive. Again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for that inspiring presentation, which I think answers one of the issues that Innocent raised, the need for African philanthropic organizations to develop and grow and make a difference. And I think through the Tony Elumelu Foundation, we can see that that is happening. You shared with us, of course, the background and philosophy of the foundation, the programs that it is engaged in, as well as the ways in which it tries to empower young people across Africa, young entrepreneurs, in terms of funding, mentoring, training, advocacy, and of course, trying to connect them to each other. And certainly the data you shared with us in terms of impact is quite impressive, in terms of business revenue growth, jobs, startups, and very critical women's participation and the commitment to gender equality. So thank you for sharing with us the work of this very important and exemplary foundation. The last but not least speaker is Carol Karuga, who is the CEO of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. She also happens to be a member of the Board of Trustees of USIU Africa. I couldn't avoid mentioning that because she's a colleague that we work with at the university. And of course, she plays a major role in the country, in Kenya, in terms of policy development when it comes to the private sector. Carol?
Thank you so much, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. I don't know who's putting up the, yes, that's my video. Where could I have the presentation put up? If not, I'll just go through the notes if it's easier that way. But thank you, and very good to see everyone. And yes, good to mention that I'm part of the USIU body. And mine is just to brief you on what we do at KEPSA and where we are and what we're seeing in the education sector. So that's what I'll focus on and keep it very short. So the Kenya Private Sector Alliance is the umbrella body of the private sector in Kenya, bringing together all the different sectors of the economy in the country. And we represent the big and the small, from multinationals to trade associations to SMEs, and also to startups in Kenya. And we are also part of the group of associations in the East African community under the East African Business Council, where we're the focal point of the private sector. Thank you very much. If we could go to the next slide. We operate through different sector boards, and we over the different sectors. And I won't go into a lot of detail on that. You can see them on the screen. And also how we engage. We actually stakeholders, our biggest stakeholder is government, because that's where we discuss the issues of business enabling environment. And we have different structures, from the roundtable with the president to the roundtable with the cabinet. And then we have the ministerial stakeholder forums, which is basically with the different ministers. Then we also engage with the parliament and what we call the speakers roundtable. We also engage with different, with the Chief Justice, because justice, of course, is important also for commercial deliberations and cases. So we have to do that, and then different agencies. But we also have a structure with the development partners also, so World Bank and others. So we do engage very and DFID and others on around different issues that affect the business community. Then we also do have regional forums, which, as I said, we engage through the East African Business Council, and each of the umbrella bodies in the country is a focal point. We could move to the next slide. And then we also, in terms of engagement with institutions of higher learning, we, as I said, because we have the different sector boards which represent different sectors of the economy, we have the education sector board, which has the basic education, which has the tertiary, which is mostly technical, and then we have the university education. And here we champion policy reforms in the sector, improvement, review of training curriculum, institutional strengthening, promoting research and innovation, among others. So when we looked at, as part of the AAP consortium, we did engage the Egerton University, which is also in Kenya, on a number of initiatives, including program for transforming African agriculture universities to meaningful contribution to Africa growth and development. So we've already started doing that even with other universities. Next. In terms of COVID and what we've been doing from the private sector side, KEPSA has done several surveys and to look at the impact on Kenya businesses. And we did one in April, and 74% of businesses reported that they were very highly impacted by COVID. And 18% are the ones who reported maybe negative impact, who are not as highly impacted. And mostly this, as you can see on my right side, which I'm hoping is your right side too, you can see the different sectors in terms of impact of the different ones. And tourism and education, actually some of the two sectors that really reported highest impact, with 96% and 90% respectively in impact of COVID. And that's because with schools closed, with airlines not moving, with transport challenges and all that. So of course, those two sectors have had the highest. And then all along, you can see the different sectors, how they've been impacted with the environment, the least. Finance, of course, the banking sector has been operating and has been very active. Agriculture, because people, mostly because of food. And all that, and construction has also been going on, not as much, but at least there's been some movement there. So you can see in terms of all the different sectors and how they've been impacted in terms of businesses. Next slide. So what we also realized from the survey, impact on the education sector, from the survey that we conducted now in May 20th, 22% of those who responded in the education sector reported high or very high negative impact. Only 28% retained employees, while 2% hired more. 84% resorted to salary cuts, and overall 320 jobs in the education sector in Kenya are actually at risk. Yesterday, the Minister of Education just mentioned that schools will not be opened until January, especially for the basic education. Universities and tertiary will be opened from September, and again, if they follow the lead protocols. And so you can see the different ones in terms of the impact that we saw in terms of the education sector. So it's very highly impacted by COVID. Next slide. What we did, once we looked at all the different sectors and seen their impact, we did engage government, and we continue to engage government, and we formed what we called an economic management framework for COVID-19 response. And that looked at all the different areas that business is affected, but a second part of it, what business is contributing to. And in terms of contributions, whether they are giving in PPEs, they're giving airtime, they're giving all the different things that business is giving to the public and to the society, even as we look at the areas that hurt most in business. And some of the stimulus responses that came out of our engagement with government from the beginning, we had tax relief, and I won't go into all the details, from tax relief of people earning less than 24 Kenya shillings, reduction of income rate tax, reduction of resident income tax, which is the corporation tax, reduction of turnover tax, and reduction of VAT from 16 to 14. So those are some of the ones that we were able to get around in April, when we first engaged as a quick stimulus from government to start cushioning, because what business said in Kenya, we're going to work very, very hard not to lay off people so that we don't cut jobs. And that was the commitment businesses gave the first 3 months, and then review after that. And we've seen a lot of businesses did keep their word, and a lot of the layoffs or unpaid leaves, a lot of that has come in as we started going into the second quarter of the year from June. But in the first 3 months, March, April, and May, a lot of businesses did keep their word to doing that. Then resources, we saw government giving another 56.6 billion in economic stimulus, and 7.4 of that was set up for education sector to support mostly infrastructure development, as well as recruitment of intern teachers and ICT interns, especially for the public schools, and so that schools could start moving online and digitalizing and offering at least some level of learning as the students home. Then monetary policy easing and liquidity challenges. We saw the central bank in Kenya lowering its CBR. We also saw banks, a lot of them agreed to restructure loans to amount worth about 273 billion to different people. And so we've been following that keenly and trying to see which sectors still have challenges on that. We also saw the government, a lot of the focus for business was saying, we're going to keep jobs if you can give us back our VAT refunds, and also you can start paying our pending bills for those who supply government. And we've seen that a lot of that being paid now, and still a bit more of the pending bills that is outstanding, but we're hoping that will be clear this month. But a lot of VAT refunds has come through. Then social protection. So government established a COVID-19 fund, which has been run by the private sector, members of KEPSA, all of them actually. And so far we've received about 1.4 billion in cash and 1.5 billion in kind donations, and a lot of that has gone into mitigating mostly health and livelihoods, really giving cash transfers to the vulnerable, but also providing PPEs to the hospitals and to health workers. And also, again, we've also seen a lot of the businesses going into providing PPEs, but also really giving a lot to the vulnerables in terms of food and whatever else is needed. Next. For the education sector response measures, closure of schools to prevent spread of the pandemic, as I mentioned. So that was the first thing that was done, and that continues to be one of the sectors that has not reopened. So what Kenya did differently was it never closed its whole economy. It never closed down, locked down like most countries did, but did partial lockdowns. And so looked at different sectors where there's, especially where people come together, whether it's like education, entertainment, sports, and such, and travel, where people are able to come together. So those are the ones which were closed, and that's been what government has been doing, reopening that slowly. And what we've been doing is engaging government on the protocols and setting our own protocols as private sector as the opening has been going on. And so that's what's been happening. Of course, the cessation of 3 counties. So we started with 5. Then 2 were reopened, and now we're left with 3, and the other 3 were reopened just 2 days ago. And so that's what Kenya has been doing in terms of a response to COVID-19. University provided their facilities to use for COVID-19 quarantine, isolation, and treatment. So we saw that as especially like Kenyatta University, and we saw that with the tourism sector providing hotels to do that. Production of medical equipment. And
Carol, you have 1 minute.
Whoa, okay. University of Technology, Kenya, we saw creation of digital content and facilitation of e-learning during the COVID-19, development of protocols for reopening of the sector, phased reopening expected from September, as I mentioned. Next, I think I'm coming to the end. Opportunities for partnership and engagement is financing infrastructure expansion, projects and provision of learning materials, equipment, so that we can start adhering to health protocols, mass production of PPEs for learners, supporting hiring more human resource capacities. These are what we are looking at as private sector, upscaling of trainers, especially on new digital tech learning, development of digital learning solutions and supply of digital devices and technology, partnership with private sector in research and innovation, especially medical research, and review of training modules to align with new COVID realities. So these are what we are moving in as private sector and look for partners to work with so that as we move into reopening of the education sector. Please allow me to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation in terms of what the private sector in Kenya is doing. And as you noted, KEPSA has been very instrumental in informing government policy, and you laid out some of the areas in which you've done that, including, of course, the various sector boards that KEPSA has, and specifically focusing on the engagement with higher education institutions, and the fact that KEPSA, of course, has undertaken many surveys on the impact of COVID on Kenyan business community in different sectors. I was struck by the figures that 96% of tourism has been affected and 90% of education has been affected for obvious reasons. And I think we also benefited learning from you the range of government responses and specifically also responses with regards to education itself and opportunities for partnership. And you left that with an appeal that you are, and a statement that you are, willing and of course committed to partnering with various organizations. So thank you very much. We have one last speaker actually that I should have mentioned earlier, and that is Kevin Urama from the African Development Bank. Kevin?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, colleagues and all the delegates that are participating in this webinar. I'd like to thank AAP for giving us the opportunity to share our thoughts with you in this very important dialogue. From the African Development Bank Group, the African Development Bank is the premier development bank for Africa, the regional bank for Africa, and we involve in several activities that tries to help in building capacity for development on the continent. The work of the African Development Bank during this decade is informed by its 10-year strategy, which has two core objectives. One is in driving inclusive growth in Africa and driving transition to green growth in Africa. In 2015, the new president, the current president of the African Development Bank, President Chukwuma, came with a laser focus on how to actually structure investments in Africa to be able to drive build resilience on the continent, and that's what he called the high fives of the high five strategies for the African Development Bank. In the high five strategies, there are 5 key things that are being focused on, and the last speaker from Kenya just spoke about the importance of investing in infrastructure. And this is what the main focus of the high five strategies of the bank group, structuring how to invest in infrastructure on the continent, both hard and soft infrastructure, in order to build inclusive and resilient growth on the continent. The first high five is to light up and power Africa. It might sound basic, but then without electricity and power, energy, we are not able to even respond to COVID-19 in the ways that we should respond to COVID-19. Most of the issues on the continent with regard to lockdown has a lot to do with lack of electricity, even to refrigerate food. If you have to acquire food in order to stay at home for some time, and so on and so forth. And also the production of PPEs and other things are all dependent on energy. Energy, power, and electricity is like blood for the economy, just like blood is for human life. The second one is to feed Africa. And the Feed Africa strategy is basically structured to help build the capacity for the continent and invest on Africa being able to produce its own food and reverse the importation of food that's going on the continent. Highly increase productivity and enable the green revolution in Africa that is yet to happen. Then the third one is to industrialize Africa, to build capacity on the continent, to be able to grow SMEs and leverage what my colleague, friend from Tony Elumelu Foundation and co have been talking about, the enormous capacity of innovators on the continent, amongst the youths and women of Africa, especially, that is really crying for funding to be able to allow them to scale. The investment infrastructure investment gap on the continent is so huge, and a lot to be done in order to make that happen. Then the next is integrate Africa. Integration is a key aspect of even addressing the COVID-19 issues, which I will talk about a little bit later in my speech. And finally, all these things brought together to improve the quality of lives for Africans. Now, I work in the African Development Institute, which is the capacity development arm of the African Development Bank Group. And within the African Development Institute, this is where the universities and institutions and partnerships actually come in, because we are focused on strengthening capacity on the continent at various levels, at individual level, at organizational level, and also at institutional level, more especially. At the institutional level, we focused a lot on state capacity, because without capacitated states on the continent, it will be difficult for these development programs that we all talk about to function effectively. So we focus on improving budget and financial management capacity. One of the speakers already talked about the dwindling aid that will happen on the continent. And that is how also, even with COVID-19, we are seeing dwindling fiscal capacity on the continent. So prudential management of public finances becomes very crucial. And public administration, the colleague from Ford Foundation has already mentioned the critical importance of public administration on the continent. And this is one area that we focus quite a lot on in terms of building capacity in that. I'll speak specifically about one particular program we're doing there, which will be very useful for this platform. Strengthening capacity for domestic resource mobilization is another key aspect that we are working on. Again, unless Africa builds capacity to harness its own resources and turn it into wealth for growth on the continent, we will be having this same kind of conferences and webinars even 10 years, 20 years, 40 years down the line. And then more importantly, also focus on the capacity for economic management, basically macroeconomic policy management on the continent. As I've mentioned already, one of the key programs we work on in the public administration is what we call the Public Service Delivery Index, to try to drive accountability and transparency in managing and monitoring public service delivery on the continent. Quite a lot of times you find that there's quite a lot of promise about how public service is going to happen on the continent. But year on year, year after year, we still continue to find that poverty is deepening, lack of access to basic facilities is ongoing, and there is hardly any way to really measure what is going on the continent. With regard to actually universities and institutions on the continent, we engage in key programs on strengthening Africa-led institutions. And strengthening Africa-led institutions is not only universities, but also policy research institutions, think tanks, ministries, and other agencies across the continent. Now, some reality check that we need to think about, because this is about COVID-19, is actually what COVID-19 means for Africa. Let me focus a little bit on the implications for universities. As we talk about digital learning, let us not forget the digital divide. If you look at even the most advanced countries in Africa, access to broadband, access to digital facilities for many children who are supposed to be benefiting from these educational programs that are increasingly going online is a huge challenge. The digital gap is very wide. So in terms of areas of partnering with universities and other institutions, donor agencies outside of the continent, and also even the African Development Bank Group, I would encourage a lot more focus on bridging that digital divide. How do we collaborate?
1 minute.
How do we collaboratively invest in bridging that digital divide for the continent, so that we're able to ensure that we don't leave many African youths behind as we go forward in doing this. Universities and higher education institutions in Africa also need to try and strengthen partnerships, not only looking outside of the continent in terms of how to build partnerships internationally, but even nationally. Universities need to learn to share resources, including faculty, equipment, and other things. So laboratories, so that we're able to scale the impact of those facilities that we have. And also regionally, between countries, between the different regions on the continent, and also more importantly, globally, as we are talking about now. And more importantly, with the private sector, just one second, please.
Yes. Yeah,
more importantly, with the private sector, that we actually need to try and build curriculum in the universities that are attractive for the private sector to come in and invest. Because if we're able to produce graduates that are of value to the private sector, they will also be more willing to invest in building that capacity within the universities as we go forward. Within the bank, we are very willing and open to partnerships with different agencies, the World Bank, our sister MDBs, and so on. And I would like to thank you again for this opportunity for this brief intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that, again, excellent presentation, about the work that the World Bank does, which is extremely important for Africa as the continent's premier
African Development Bank, please, not the World Bank.
African Development Bank. Yes, premier institution for the continent in terms of development. You shared with us the strategic direction of the bank and how that has panned out in terms of investment on energy, Feed Africa, Industrialize Africa, Integrate Africa, and of course the various focus in terms of priorities in strengthening capacity at the institutional level, as well as in terms of domestic resource mobilization. And your focus on universities was particularly welcome in sharing with us the focus on digital learning, but reminding us, of course, of the digital divide and the extreme importance of partnerships among higher education institutions across the continent in sharing resources from faculty to curriculum and so on. So once again, thank you for that presentation. We have had a very rich set of insights as well as sharing of experiences from different presenters, of course, representing different areas of potential collaboration and partnership for universities. So we have a series of questions, and I'm very mindful of the fact that time is rather limited. And what I'll do is I'll ask each person to respond to those questions as briefly as possible. Some of the questions were asked prior to the meeting, and others, of course, have been asked during the course of the presentations. So I'll start with Tibor, because I know that he's supposed to be leaving very shortly. The question that one of the participants asked is about the fact that COVID-19 has reduced funding for with inequality, poverty, and exclusions. What is the plan of the US government in terms of emergency support for African universities during this COVID period?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, in responding to COVID-19, we have to respond on the basis of the low-hanging fruit and then move up the tree. The most immediate response has to do with health, welfare. Then you compound that with the, for example, the hunger. because unfortunately parts of Africa, not only are they being hit by COVID at this point, but they're also being hit by locust infestations. So, you know, we have come forth in, I think, sub-Saharan Africa, we're now at over 400 million. But, you know, a lot of people say, oh, 400 million, the United States is so rich, you can certainly do a lot more. And people forget that in the last 20 years, when it comes to health assistance in Africa, the United States has actually provided $100 billion. That's B with a B dollars. So I think the American people have been very, very, very generous. Unfortunately, I have to say that because given the immense amount of needs, the tertiary education system is always the one that you know, is at the end of the line. So that's why one of the reasons I'm so passionate about U.S. University and African university exchanges and partnerships is because that leverages more than the government portion. It leverages our immense university system, but also our private sector, because the United States doesn't have state-owned corporations. We have a massive, massive private sector. So, you know, when it comes to COVID, health first, then hunger, and then education. Over.
Thank you. And the last question for you was raised before, that a lot of people in the world, including in Africa, have been watching events in the United States following the killing of George Floyd, which has raised questions about the nature of US society, as well as, of course, government attitude. Race being, of course, a key issue in that context. How can the US be trusted? The ways in which some of those challenges seem to have, you know, tainted the image of the United States across the continent.
Yeah, thanks for asking the easy question. You know, for the United States, there have been three major movements when it comes to race relations. One, of course, was the Civil War, which ended slavery, but then the Reconstruction period. That was one. The second was the Civil Rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. The historians will obviously, you know, evaluate this, but I suspect that what's happening now is the third major movement, where we hopefully will come out of this with finally much more honest and much more positive race relations. What's encouraging? Let me tell you what's encouraging. The murder was horrible. Number one, everybody has to acknowledge that it was a murder. Two, America's institutions are strong enough to handle these kinds of things. As you saw, the police involved in this were immediately charged, and people are going forward facing charges of murder. And, you know, I believe that justice as much as possible will be done. And this has unleashed a huge social movement, which we can all do very positive outcomes. What I like about the United States is we are very willing to look ourselves in the mirror and point out where the faults are, instead of you know, trying to suppress the information or push it under the rug. And of course, this impacts our relations with Africa more than any other continent, obviously, because of the victimhood and the whole history of our race relations. Over.
Thank you very much. My next set of questions are for Claudia. Again, some of them were asked before, others have been asked in the course of this forum. Claudia, you talked about the diaspora program that Carnegie has been running. How effective has that program been? And at what extent can online instruction and research be something that the program can incorporate?
Paul, thank you so much. We have been running this program since about 2014, so it's a relatively short period of time, about 5 years. We have conducted evaluations, and you know, as you know as well, you know, what we see is that there is a lot of sharing of resources, long-term relationships, graduate supervision. I think the technology is enabling this even more to continue sustained partnerships between American universities and African universities through the entry point of diaspora academics. We see sometimes, although our fellowships support academics in North America to spend time at African universities, we see sometimes these universities inviting postgraduate students and postdoctoral students back to the US or North America. So I think our early findings show that it is promising. There's a lot of sharing of laboratories, sharing of books. There's a huge amount of goodwill. I think that's an important part of the diaspora, and the amount of contribution is way over the amount that we support. And as the research you did at the outset of the program, it really showed how much was already going on between the diaspora and African universities. And that's really what the program tried to build on, what was already existing. And as far as online, I think that's something, you know, we certainly will be looking at. We have seen some of that going on already with graduate supervision, external examination, a lot of applications already. And I think some joint teaching programs, online blended learning across the continents have come up in the fellowships that we've currently funded. We leave it to the universities. Our approach has really been that it's the African universities that should make the demand, so it's not just supply driven. So they apply for the projects, they can choose the academics they want to work with, you know, as you're well aware, as the chair of the advisory board. But I think the future, and I think that's something, you know, with the advisory board of that one particular program, is that we'll really need to look at what does it look like in this new environment, and what are the opportunities for ongoing virtual diaspora exchanges.
The second question for you, you noted that the Carnegie Corporation of New York has maintained its commitment to education as a sector of support, and others haven't. Why have you maintained that, and how can you convince other foundations to come back, as it were, to higher education?
That's an excellent question. As you know, we had something called the Partnership for Higher Education in Africa for 10 years between 2000 and 2010. That was very much driven by the presidents of the foundations, including our own, who is a former president of Brown University. So he's very much, you know, a supporter of the higher education sector and this particular program, and he's been with us since its outset. So I think, you know, a lot of times when presidents change, the strategies of the foundations change, and many foundations have moved to more thematic themes or grand challenges rather than in supporting the institutions. And, you know, we look to others as well. We think this is a really important area, and especially over the long term, having long-term commitments. This is what we hear from our advisors, including yourself and our other grantees, that it's really important to build the academic staff for the next generation, given the youth bulge, as others have pointed out, et cetera.
Thank you. My next set of questions will go to Himdat. And one of the questions is the work that the Centers for Excellence is doing. It's an excellent initiative. What opportunities exist for collaboration with other programs, specifically mobilizing African diaspora scholars' immense skills and knowledge to support the continent? This builds on what Claudia was sharing with us.
Thanks so much for this question. I think, so as I said earlier, so the ACE program is really very much a bottom-up approach. So the leadership is by the African universities, is by the African scientists, is by the African principal investigators, who came together, prepared a proposal, and submitted this is what they want to do around education programs, around applied research, around partners with industry or sector, around partnership in terms of research consultancies or sort of sustainable programs that they want to do in terms of revenue generation, looking at international accreditation to improve.
You're frozen.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you're back.
Yeah, so looking at international accreditation partnerships that they can undertake to raise the quality of the teaching and learning, and of course around improving, the general teaching and learning environment with better equipment, labs, etc. So that's what the funding is used for. And therefore, if they see a value in working with a university, we have a lot of agriculture centers. For example, the West Africa Center for Crop Science in University of Ghana. They're working with Cornell University in the States quite significantly in terms of the agricultural research, given the sort of sectoral knowledge there. However, they're also working extensively with agricultural universities in Nigeria, for example, because the issues, you know, one of the big items is regional collaboration. The whole point of the ACE program is to enhance regional specializations, being, you know, in addition to the support at the national level to universities at the national aspect in terms of, you know, financing, governance, and just overall improvement of quality, etc. The regional centers of excellence is saying, okay, in addition to that, we also need specialized centers where, with the scarce resources, with the economies of scale, and more importantly, at this particular moment in time, even if we wanted to have a center of excellence in infectious diseases, for example, in every country in the continent, we may not have the faculty today to do that, or sort of the technical information. So we need to find a way in which we can encourage the partnership, and the project does that immensely. In fact, the whole design is around results-based financing, where there are bonuses on regional students. When you're able to bring in regional students, it's actually a sort of bigger, and excuse my technical language, what we call disbursement linked indicator. So it's a bigger result for you when you're able to mobilize more funds. If you do regional cross collaboration on applied research, that's also double the funding. So the whole amount that comes to the university is based on a set of results. It's not just given on a blank check. It's sort of like, you know, intermittent, you know, postgraduate expansion. You're increasing your PhD and master students. You're meeting, you know, global benchmarks on your accreditation program, etc. So for us, the way I see it about, and we have, as I said, it's a proposal and an implementation plan by the university. I think a key point is the and it's a performance-based contracting. So whatever's within the implementation plan is supported. And that is reviewed by peers, academic and scientific peers that work with the Association of African Universities to ensure that the activities are linked towards the objective. The only thing I would say is the project upfront has a parameter around partnerships, where at least 10 to 15% of the funding must be spent on partnerships. And I think within that, we have an amount that has to be spent on African partnerships to ensure that there is, in addition, the demand, but also the supply of ensuring that that it's not only brick and mortar, but also soft and you know, intellectual partnerships and research partnerships that take place. And as I said, I shared the links of the ACE programs on the chat, and I think when you go in there, you'll have a plethora of all the different universities and ACE is working with contact information of the principal investigators, or what we call the center leaders, that are sort of responsible for implementing this. And when they submitted the proposals, almost all of them had a ton of MOUs. But MOUs are just pieces of paper that don't mean much, as far, you know, unless you actually implement those MOUs and have key indicators and sort of key actions that are linked to that. And we work quite hard to ensure that we provide support around what makes a partnership work, what are the sort of elements of a strong partnership arrangement, from, you know, the financial transparency to the sort of commitment and review process, etc. So I'll just stop there, but I don't know if there's specific questions on how and where to go. I think that's at the website, and also I'm happy to share the information of the Association of African Universities, which has a grant to facilitate this work at the ACE level, but then at the ACE level. So it's really it's demand-based. What is the issue at hand that we want to do a partnership in? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last question for you, and maybe you can just give me, you know, very, very shortly, in half a minute. The need for resources by African universities is huge. What should be the 3 top priorities, do you think, you know, from your position in the bank, for African universities? Just very briefly, 3 top priorities. to deal with this crisis, recover from this crisis, and become even stronger after the crisis?
Thank you. I think that's an incredibly hard question. I mean, the way that, and of course, and this is from conversation that we've been having with the African faculty, and based on the discussions that they've come up with, I think the number one is the realization that we need to invest in the technological capacity at African institutions in terms of connectivity and bandwidth. I think that is the number one, and sort of, you know, going global and going international is part of the longer term strategy. And to do that, you need virtual connectivity and for that internationalization. But to do that at home and to deliver to students at home, you need to, there is a realization across universities and the national commissions for higher education of the need to invest on the bandwidth connectivity of the NGRNs and the universities themselves. And I think within that, also the know-how to be able to teach online and be able to effectively engage students and have a blended approach towards teaching, and not, of course, replace the teacher-student relationship or student-student relationship, but a blended approach. So that would be one. The second thing I think is the role of African universities within the response of the country, within the health response, the teaching of the human resource for health workers, the applied research on the testing and sequencing, the production of PPE materials. I think in the short and medium term, this is very, very important, and that African universities can have this mantle and leadership to work effectively with governments to respond. And I guess the third thing I think is just sort of on the realization on the learning on digital skills itself as a technical field, and as a sort of digital economy field, in how you utilize digital skills, both advanced and sort of the basic in the delivery of education at large. And I think there's an important need for universities to see how they fit that space, how they support teachers within the system to teach basic education, but also as a sort of opportunity to produce the skilled and ICT sort of knowledge economy, the blue economy that Africa can be part of.
Thank you.
So those are the three things that I just came up with. Thank you.
Very well articulated. Thank you very much. For Innocent, the first question is, how can the multinational funding agencies help tertiary institutions in capacity development and resource sourcing in the post-COVID era?
Thank you for that question, but it goes back to what I said. African higher education institutions need to know that COVID-19 is going to change everything. Instead of asking the question of how can multinational institutions help African higher education institutions with funding and all, it's actually what do African higher education institutions have to put on the table that will make multinational institutions who may not be inclined to funding them to come and talk, because those who are providing the funding also have an interest. So when we go cap in hand, say, how do you help us here? How do you help us? I'm sorry, I'm not speaking like a donor. I'm supposed to wear Ford Foundation hat and all that. But when I get asked this question, I like to push back and say, from higher education on the continent, what are we putting on the table? Take, for instance, this issue of COVID-19. Africa is not contributing to funding for the research. It's only South Africa that I know of that actually has its personnel on the research. African conservative institutions like churches using conspiracy theories are telling Africans not to be involved in the clinical trials. So at the end of the day, when this vaccine is eventually produced, we will come to say, oh, on the basis of equity, Africa should, benefit from it. So we need to find a way of putting something on the table. And it links to the question somebody asked earlier, how do we get Ford Foundation back to funding higher institutions? I want to make a clarification that when I mean that we don't have a higher education program, it's actually a portfolio of programs that funds higher education on a sustainable basis. What we have now is what you might call utilitarian relationship based on needs and what higher education can offer. For instance, we have a program in University of Vet. We have endowed philanthropy chair there to respond to this whole idea of growing African philanthropy. So we have a philanthropic chair we have endowed there with teaching capacity and also running programs around philanthropy. In Lagos Business School, we are working with the school to train non-profit leaders because there is actually no higher education institution in West Africa that I know that offers certificate, diploma, or degree program on non-profit leadership and management. And this is an area of growth, a low-hanging fruit that universities can develop program around and get support for it. We're also talking about how do we ensure that people who are retiring from professional bodies, instead of going to their villages and whiling away, can be brought on board in universities as professors of practice. We're looking for universities that will be interested in developing programs around professors of practice so that they can tap into people retiring from the private sector. So these are the areas universities can develop programs, come to the table and say, this is what we have. Can we work in this area? I shared earlier that we are working on ending violence against women and girls. If I have a university center or a university institution that say, hey, we are interested in working in this area, sexual harassment is such a big issue on our campus, we're looking for partners that will help us to end it so that our women and girls on campuses can feel safe and go about their program. I want to link finally with a question Philip asked, that we have been pursuing donor-supported development agenda in Africa since independence. And it has not gotten us a good headway. What is the next phase for all of this? And I would say that beginning with the SDGs, there have actually been a movement away from this donor dependency, that Africa is open for business. What Africa needs is investment and not donor aid. And this COVID-19 is going to bring that to the fore. Because if you look at, we're dealing in an area where people are withdrawing from multilateralism, from international solidarity. The big countries are no longer on the table. So it's time for us to begin to come back home, meet at the village square on campuses, or to ask ourselves, how are we going to fill this gap? Thank you.
And in half a second, half a minute, if you can respond to this. The question that the person asked, I would like to know how the Ford Foundation works with other partners on African matters, especially with African foundations
so
that are emerging.
We go into alliance, our peer foundations like MacArthur Foundation, Open Society Foundation, Gates on a number of occasions on issues that we care about, like the $1 billion COVID-19 social bond that I talked about. We have other foundations like MacArthur that contributed. It's actually 1.7 billion if you look at the contributions of those other foundations. When we had a new government in Nigeria that prioritized anti-corruption, we worked with MacArthur and Open Society Initiative for West Africa to set up an anti-corruption and criminal justice reform fund. It was the Nigerian government through the Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption to do all the work that they did that actually led to recovery of over $3 billion. So whenever we have an alignment of programmatic priorities, we do go together to work it. In South Africa, we also work with Open Society Foundation to see the constitutionalism fund that enabled a number of litigations in South Africa to push the frontiers of constitutional development in Africa. So we do a lot of partnership, but it has to be on the basis of alignment of priorities.
Thank you very much. I'll now move to Sumachi. The question is, what is your foundation doing with higher education institutions in Africa?
Thank you so much, Paul. The Tony and Melly Foundation, again, is committed to supporting these young Africans. But then we also, have a firm belief in an economic philosophy that we call Africapitalism. So the philosophy of Africapitalism states that we need the private sector to take the leading role in development in Africa. We can no longer, continue exactly as my the colleague from Ford Innocent from Ford Foundation, said, we can no longer continue as a continent to rely on aid, charity, philanthropy, etc. We need to empower the private sector to play its leading role in developing the continent, in creating the jobs, in driving innovation, in generating revenue, etc., etc. It is only until we have a capacitized, well-resourced private sector that Africa will truly be sustainably transformed. And so we work with African universities and universities abroad to do more research on Africapitalism, to really codify the philosophy so that it's, it's taught and is learned in our academic institutions across the continent, so that young people leaving college, leaving universities, have the right mindset of getting jobs, of becoming employed members or entrepreneurs of the private sector in transforming the continent for good. We move forward from the handouts, charity mindsets to one of self-sustainability, one of entrepreneurship, one of getting adequate employment to help transform the continent through private sector. So that's the work we do with African higher institutions. We do research work around Africapitalism, codifying it, institutionalizing it, and making sure that young Africans in schools and universities across the continent are able to learn about this philosophy and imbibe it for good.
The last question for you, someone asked, the $5,000 that the foundation gives to the youth entrepreneurs, is it a loan or a grant?
No, so thanks for that, Paul. And I think it's a good question to make the very important distinction. So as I said earlier, it's a non-returnable seed capital. So we don't expect you to give us back. We don't expect any interest on it. This is totally non-returnable, is our own investment in your future. So it's $5,000 from our founder Family Wealth, investing in each African entrepreneur on our program, because we believe that these entrepreneurs need that, that funding capital, that capital that allows them transform their ideas to businesses, that capital that allows them employ more hands, get more tools, build an office space, etc. That capital of hope. And so that's the hope, and that's the risk we're willing to take on in these entrepreneurs. So it's totally non-returnable. You don't get it back. It's not a loan. It's non-interest.
Thank you very much. My next question is for Carol. Should the inauguration of the African Continental Free Trade Area have been postponed because of COVID-19, does this slow down the momentum of engagement for intra-African partnerships? Carol? All right, maybe we have lost her. Let me move to the last speaker, Orama. You outlined 5 areas that will propel Africa's development ahead. How is Africa prepared with adequate human resource capacity to deliver this strategy? And then, of course, this is also, the person who asked this ties it to the diaspora and how you can also mobilize the diaspora in realizing these goals.
Okay, thank you very much. The high 5 strategies of the bank, like I've mentioned, is basically the blueprint for investing in both hard and soft infrastructure to ensure that Africa can achieve inclusive and green growth. And amongst that, the one that is on improving the quality of lives for Africans deals with universities, investments in science, technology, and innovation, and human capital development. And so we do recognize there is a gap in terms of the human capacity to be able to deliver inclusive development on the continent. And that's why we're investing in building that capacity, even from what the African Development Institute is doing. There are several programs that we're running, which I may not be able to run through today because of the challenge of time. But one of the things I want to point out is the one program we have that's called the Capacity Development Coordination Platform. We recognize the dwindling aid, the dwindling fiscal resources within the continent to finance universities, finance research institutions in Africa, And there is need for us to come together in terms of collaborating and actually sharing good resources and human capital in order to be able to deliver better. For example, if you think about health in Africa, which is what we're talking about, there are several biomedical research centers in Africa that are doing very well. And then other countries need more of that. But then if we increase the clientele of those performing ones by linking them up with other countries where their services are needed, there will be higher demand for their services. I always believe that universities need to produce products that actually are demanded, and that is where the resources for the universities more sustainably will come, including from the private sector. So that's one key area that we need to think about as we move forward in that direction. On the diaspora, it's a huge area that we're working on, first in terms of securitizing investments from the diaspora. There's a lot of consumption smoothing that diasporans are doing, sending billions of dollars to the continent, but mostly to relatives to fill consumption gaps. But if we can actually securitize this and be able to use that for investments in their home countries, it will help to build development better. But also on programs of reversing the brain drain, and also turning brain drain into brain circulation. So we are creating platforms where African diaspora will be facilitated to engage more with their countries and also other countries in Africa, both on training, policy dialogue, sharing knowledge, and also investments and investment promotion, without having to ask them to leave and come back to the continent. Existing surveys show that up to 60% would want to go back, but many others want to remain where they are and continue to access the facilities they have in order to be able to come.
I'm afraid we have to stop there. Thank you very much. I want to thank all the presenters. I'm sure the participants will agree with me. This was a very enlightening forum in which we have learned quite a lot. So thank you all. Claudia, Innocent, Tibor, Himdat, Somachi, Caro, and of course, Kevin. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights from your foundations. I'll now hand it over to the organizers from the Alliance for African Partnership.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much, colleagues, for this very inspiring dialogue session today. I think we've had an excellent set of panelists. We were wondering at first if we could manage the time with the number of panelists that we invited, and you know, learning from these different organizations, the foundations, the government agencies, and the private sector, of what their organizations are working on now and how they intend to work going forward post-COVID. But I think they have managed to give excellent presentations and to answer the questions that came from the audience. And so we are very thankful to all of you. We actually began this series as the AAP because we wanted to hear directly from African universities about their challenges and their responses and the areas that they identify themselves as priorities going forward. And so since the start of the pandemic, it is very clear to us that African higher education institutions have responded with many innovations to solve their own problems locally. But of course, including working with local, regional, and international partners. And we have been pushing this as the AP to strengthen collaborations and to work with our colleagues, looking at South-South collaborations, but also working with international partners in the North. We've seen a number of teams amongst our institutions just coming from this dialogue series being established to work on a whole range of topics, from developing the ventilator prototypes that we heard from in the first session, sociocultural dynamics of migration, educational inequalities, online learning, mental health issues, food security and livelihoods, artificial intelligence, youth transformation. So we've seen these teams just springing up, and of course with some facilitation and nudging from our focal points and the management team at AAP. And we will continue to facilitate the development of these teams across our consortium. So on behalf of the AAP in the MSU office and our Africa office in Malawi. Let me thank the panelists again for today, for the time that you spent with us. We know how busy you all are. I know that you had to run in and out of this session. Some of you, you're still working in the trenches, as we know, as COVID is still live and spreading in many different countries. So again, thank you. Series. I want to thank, I forgot to thank Paul. Paul, you have done us an incredible amount of service as a member of the AAP and as part of the advisory board. We are indeed grateful to you for your every 2 weeks support and commitment to being the moderator. I think throughout the series, we've heard from attendees about the fantastic job that you did with moderating each of these dialogues sessions. And I think today again, this time you came with a hard hat and managed the time for us to finish on time in this particular series. So thanks again, Paul. So we will start back again with another set of dialogues. We realize that these virtual dialogues are actually very interesting and important for our consortium members to work together, to speak to each other and to speak amongst others that have similar issues and areas of interest. And so we will continue with our dialogue series. We'll start back again in September. So please keep looking at our social media and emails from the Alliance for African Partnership. We will, however, be having a program on August 5th. We have a program within the AAP called the African Futures Research Leadership Program. This is a 1-year program where members, early career researchers from our member institutions visit MSU for a year, working with a mentor at MSU and another mentor from their home institution. We've had a group of 8 women researchers with us for about almost a year now, and they will be returning to their home institutions in August. And before they leave, we intend to have a dissemination workshop with them. And this will be held on August 5th. And we're inviting you all as well to hear what these women researchers have been working on over the past year. They've had some challenges because they were here with us in the heart of the whole COVID pandemic. It has been challenging, but they have survived, they have done well. And we are really proud of this first cohort of African Futures scholars. And so we thank you again. We look forward to seeing you on the 5th, and have a great summer or winter, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.